Lessons Learned, a show where we talk about the good, the bad, and the lessons in between. I'm your host, Captain Alyssa Hinckley, and this is Lessons Learned. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lessons Learned. Joining us in the studio today to share some of the lessons she has learned is Major Jacque Morey. Welcome to the show, and glad to have you on.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, I know we've talked about having you on the show a couple times before, so I'm really glad that we finally have you here. So for our listeners, they all know that for our listeners, I don't know if anybody actually listens to this show. Maybe my mom is the only one. So for my mom to know and have
Alyssa's mom.
So to give a little bit of context on Major Morey, I'll just give you a quick 101 on her career. She spent a decade as a human resource professional in the civilian workforce prior to joining the full-time staff in the Wyoming Military Department. She served in a variety of assignments here to include the operations officer for the 153rd Force Support Squadron, the executive officer for the Wyoming Adjutant General, and currently she serves as the military personnel management officer for the Wyoming Air National Guard. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Wyoming and a master's in public administration, also from the University of Wyoming. She is happily married to her wife, Sarah, and together they have 5 children. And of course, that's just a little snippet of her in her career and her personal life. But let's get into it. Major Morey, can you tell me a little bit about the start of your military career and what initially got you to join?
Yeah, so I joined in 2012, and I initially started looking at the Guard seriously, looking at the Wyoming National Guard in 2010. I had started the Leadership Wyoming program, and 2 of my classmates were currently serving, one in the Army Guard and one in the Air Guard. And at that point, I was in my late 20s, and I confided in one of them that I had looked at the National Guard and the military in general as a high schooler, and talked to a recruiter actually from the Montana Army National Guard, and took this idea home, and it wasn't well received or supported. I think there's not a history of family military service in my family, and so I think that it was kind of scary for my parents to think about sending a daughter off to the military, and it didn't help that it was around the time that some of the scandals were coming out about basic training and just how women were being treated, and that didn't sit well with my parents. And so initially, without their support, it seemed like this really scary thing to do, but it always stayed with me, this kind of nagging thing. So I confided in one of my Leadership Wyoming classmates that it was something that I regretted if I looked back over my life. And she said, well, why don't you join now? I was like, I'm almost 30. I'm too old. Yeah. She kind of laughed and was like, no, you're not. You're not too old. And it's not that uncommon in the National Guard either, that particular path. So I commissioned as a medical services officer in the 187th Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron, and did that as a drill status guardsman for about 4.5 years before I found a full-time assignment.
Okay, great. So starting out as a medical, can you give us kind of a little bit more about started out in medical services and then moved to personnel, or how does that? Sure. Sorry for anybody out there who's Air Force who actually knows this stuff. I'm Army, so I'm like completely clueless. So give us kind of a little bit of where you transitioned to.
So I think a combination of getting some mentorship and advice from those 2 individuals who happened to both be officers in my Leadership Wyoming class, and then another individual who I knew who served as an enlisted member in the Air Evac Squadron. They all pushed me towards the officer path, and that position happened to be open. My educational background fit as part of the requirements to join that career field, and it was different than what I was doing, but other people told me that could be a benefit, right? Like, go do something in your civilian life and do something a little different on drill, and it adds some variety. Right. And that made sense to me. And so I applied for that commissioning opportunity. I was direct commissioned as a first lieutenant. And I did that, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being part of that squadron. It's the most deployed squadron in the Wyoming Military Department. So they're busy. They've got a great mission. The impact is, tangible. And I did background, like medical admin stuff.
Right.
Supporting our flight crews that included nurses and med techs. But my experience, my work experience was all in human resources. Mm-hmm. And when a full-time position opened that was as a personnel officer, that just felt like a good fit. It felt like what I had sort of been training for and what my experience had led me to. So I got to wear the uniform full-time, which I loved, and I got to do something that felt more comfortable and known to me. So I made that leap over and cross-trained at that point.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about, one of the things that I always hear about and I like to talk about, I'm full-time and I have only ever been MDay for a very brief 6-month period of time. So you said you were MDay or a DSG for about 4 years. Can you kind of talk about the struggles or maybe the ups and the downs of being a DSG and kind of how you navigated the work-life balance between not wearing the uniform every single day and then, having to kind of switch hats and come in on the drill weekend?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, at this point, I'm almost 6.5 years removed from feeling that, mm-hmm. that struggle that our MDay soldiers and our drill status airmen are constantly juggling. And a shout out to those folks because that's what the Guard is all about. And as a full-timer, my role is to support them and do what I can to make their lives a little bit easier. I personally, the benefits of doing that, I felt like I got a lot better at my civilian job. Mm-hmm. The things that I was learning in the military, the leadership lessons already as like a young lieutenant, they translated well to the civilian sector. And so I felt like I was getting better at my civilian job through my military service. More challenges, I'd say, just having to shift gears, show up at drill. And my tempo became coming in the day before drill started.
Oh, right.
Check email, try to get a handle on the schedule, stay a step ahead of any airmen that I was supervising, just so when they came, I've got my ducks in a row and I can help them. But it was this constant struggle, and I felt like a pull between the two careers.
Right.
Like, where was my focus going to be? And I understood at some point for both of them, I probably couldn't do what I wanted to do in that career path because I had the other thing pulling on me. And when I sat down and kind of took stock of my life, wearing the uniform meant a tremendous amount to me. It felt like I had waited a long time to make that jump, and I didn't want to give that up. And so I decided to kind of put my eggs in that basket.
Right. So kind of going back to all the way back to originally when you first joined and your parents were really concerned about you as a female joining, I'd like to kind of go through that a little bit. Since you joined, it was a little later than that time period that you actually did join. And what would you say your experience as being a female in the Air National Guard has been? Do you think, have you had a good experience?
I've had a great experience. And I remember going to visit Aerovac with my recruiter mm-hmm. before I interviewed. I had put in an application, really excited, wanted to make some connections at the unit. So he sponsored me on base. We went and visited the unit. And I was shocked by how many females I met just at that first visit. And I will say a medical unit tends to attract more women. I don't know what the percentage is, but mm-hmm. it's got to be, it's well over a third, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And so right away, that particular myth was sort of dispelled for me. Like,
right.
I'm seeing these women. And then the same moving into the Force Support Squadron in the personnel arena, same kind of dynamic. So I never experienced what my parents were afraid that I'd experience. I do think it's a benefit, though, having been older, being more right. seasoned or wise or kind of knowing who I was at that point.
Right.
And so having a lot of civilian work experience behind me as well. So it's been a great experience, and I felt supported as a woman, and I think my parents watching how my career has unfolded has completely changed their mind
right.
about what military service looks like.
Yeah, that's great. I think oftentimes we hear there's a lot of negative about serving. And so it's good to hear that, there's a lot of women out there that have positive experiences. Did you feel that, you talked about the Leadership Wyoming, and I know one of those Leadership Wyoming officers ended up being one of your mentors throughout your career that you still keep in contact with today. What has your experience been with, female mentors and kind of growing up in an organization and kind of leaning on those female mentors specifically?
I have benefited greatly from really strong female mentors, starting with that first individual, and then meeting along the way a handful of others. And I think that there is a strong community in the Wyoming National Guard across both genders.
Right.
But I see more examples of this than the opposite, where there are people willing to grab onto somebody and help them in their career, or be a sounding board, or, going to someone and confiding about what your goals are. And
right.
then that person sort of looking for opportunities for you, and not in a inappropriate way, but like, hey, did you see this? I just had this happen to me this week. A mentor called me and said, did you see this come out in email, this developmental opportunity? Mm-hmm. Would you consider doing something like that? And it's not a job. It's like an education opportunity.
Right.
This kind of fits some of the things that we've talked about. And so I found more examples of that. And I do have strong female mentors, but I also have strong male mentors.
Right. Mentorship is kind of one of those things. I know you and I, so for our listeners, we're kind of cheating because Major Morey and I are actually really good friends. So I know a lot about her life, and we have conversations very often. So her and I were having a conversation the other day, and we were talking about mentorship. And within that conversation, somebody else brought up, everybody says, hey, you should go out and find a mentor. You should go ask somebody to be your mentor. And it was kind of leading the conversation was going towards, it's really awkward when you get approached by somebody and they say, hey, can you be my formal mentor? And you're like, that's weird. I wish we could just naturally grow into mentors and mentee. But you offered a very unique perspective that I've never really heard before. So I wanted you to elaborate on that about, the formal mentorship relationship and what that means to you and how you've kind of navigated that.
I've had two specific and recent examples of men actually approaching me and saying, I want you to be my mentor. I want to have that specific formal relationship with you. And neither one of them were individuals that I felt like I already had maybe something close to mentorship with. Mm-hmm. They were individuals that were known to me, that I had worked with in some form or fashion. But it wasn't like you now approaching me and saying, we've been friends for a couple of years, would you mentor me? Right. It was, they were people that were more distant to me coming and saying, I want this. And I would never discourage somebody from having that conversation. And if you're listening and you're being approached by somebody who says that to you, the first thing you should do is feel humbled that somebody would seek you out for that purpose. And then thank them, because it probably took, some gumption or some, they had to be brave in that moment in approaching you. And it probably did feel a little awkward, but starting off that formal there are so many benefits to that. And right off the bat, I'd say, just lining out expectations. So what are you hoping these are questions I would ask them. What are you hoping to get out of this relationship? How often do you want to meet with me? Because my time is valuable.
Right.
We each have 168 hours in the week, and I know where mine go and where I want them to go. And so if I'm going to make time for this, I need to understand what you're hoping to get out of it. I don't want to, be 2 years down the road and for you to feel like this was a waste of time. Right. Because it can only be valuable for me if it's valuable for that individual. And I don't think that can happen as cleanly if it's a more gradual, like, this is my friend and I go to this person for advice. Mm-hmm. It kind of jumped off the relationship in a more formal and expectations up front. We both know what we're trying to get out of this. And over one of those relationships is now a little over 2 years old, and the other one's a little over a year old, where it becomes less formal, right? It starts out formal, and you're hitting specific topics, and I would basically give them homework. Like, hey, like I said, my time's valuable, so what do you want? What do you want to learn, or what are we going to be talking about? So we've read books together. So then we get together and we talk about the book. Did you agree? Did you disagree? How can you apply this concept? We might read an article about leadership together and then discuss that. Let's apply that to a current situation that you're facing. And the other thing that I've done with both of those individuals, and then anyone else I feel like I have a more loosely structured mentorship relationship with, is just try to make it clear that if you really want me to be your mentor, one of the things that you should expect is I'm going to push back on what you can do.
Right.
Like where's your power in this situation? And again, the formal ask allows that discussion to be had. Like, I don't need a friend to gossip with. I'm not seeking that at this point in my life and my career. But if you are open to hearing what I think that you could do, or we problem solve that together, but it comes down to actions that you can take, then absolutely. I love doing that. That's one of my favorite parts about being in this organization, about being a military officer, about interacting with my peers.
Right. Yeah, I think oftentimes, and I've been guilty of this too, is I have a mentor, but then the only times I go to them is when it's like, I'm stressed, help me out. And so